Hi, everyone. This is Karen Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists, and this is the second in a series of federal policy webinars during the COVID pandemic to talk through what we're thinking about and what we're doing in terms of preparing for a stimulus bill or a reauthorization during 2020. This is a re-recording of the webinar because it did not record the first time. So what I'd like to talk about first is start off with where we were, talk about what has happened over the last month, spend some time talking about what was in the HEROES Act that the House passed, um, and then talk about where Congress is right now. While we in the advocacy community are talking quite a bit about stimulus and the possibilities of stimulus, almost all the conversation on Capitol Hill in terms of transportation is about reauthorization. So that's one key message I want to get out today. So then I want to talk about, is reauthorization really possible? What it would take for that to happen, and then talk about our strategy moving forward. So where we left off. So at the last presentation, I talked about how I was thinking about the COVID response in three sets: the emergency relief, where we were trying to get some policy changes to make it easier for states and communities to do short-term temporary builds. We are still pushing for that. Then I thought there would be, or could be, a stimulus, and then finally recovery. And I was thinking about reauthorization in terms of recovery. We also talked about the need for an evolving solution. So thinking about the fact that the decisions made either through reauthorization or stimulus are going to set us up for transportation for years into the future. But that at the same time that is happening, we are seeing changes in society that may change what kind of transportation we want or what we need. So how do we make sure that we make the right decisions now moving forward? And how do we do it, and how do we prioritize transportation in the middle of a pandemic and in the middle of an economic crisis that's happening all around us? And one where we really don't know what the timeline is. I used this tweet from Dan Rather, which says, maybe when all this is over, we can widen the sidewalks. I think this is a double-edged sword because it's absolutely great that we're getting a whole bunch of new people biking, walking, thinking about needing wider sidewalks. At the same time, that beginning part of when this is all over, I think that characterizes the sort of the situation we're in, where we want to be cognizant and sensitive to everything that's going on, but also realizing policy changes now are going to affect us moving into the future. So what has changed in a month? We've hit the 100,000 deaths. It's actually 36 million unemployed now, with those in the lower income bracket getting hit the hardest. We're also finding out that this is not a short-term situation. We're seeing that many employers have already said we're not going to reopen until September. Some, or reopen their offices, particularly offices. January is another date we're seeing. And we're also seeing places like, I think it was Twitter and Nationwide, say, maybe we're just going to go remote from now on. And so we see that office culture changing. We also know, in terms of how long this is going to go on, that in some areas, schools have already said they're not reopening full-time in the fall. That's at least true in the Mid-Atlantic, where I am. DC, Virginia, and Maryland are not expected to go to full-time school. And that, again, is going to affect the workforce, who's commuting, who's not, etc. And then in Congress, we saw two big changes. One, the House passed the HEROES Act, which I'm going to talk through. And the second is how the Senate has sort of pulled back about when and whether there needs to be more stimulus. Finally, we also know that without more federal funding, there's going to be some more hardship, and well, hardship in general. So in July, the CARES Act runs out. That was, I think it was a 10-week program, which means that the unemployment payments drop to normal. And normal in Mississippi means $215 a week. That's the lowest. Massachusetts, which is the highest, their average is $555 a week. So even though our unemployment level is so high right now, people do have funding, and we have seen an increase in consumer goods in some things, bikes among them, while people either got their stimulus check, or if they're on unemployment, they're making maybe a livable wage, which in all of that may change. And we may see this weird situation in the next couple months where our unemployment level falls as people go back to work, but economic hardship rises because the people who are unemployed are now making a lot less, and some of those people going back to work are making less. And they still have childcare concerns, and other concerns that maybe they didn't have before the coronavirus issue. Also, the payroll protection program, that funding expires in July, and that's, so if there's a question about, those were forgivable loans if you used it all on certain things in a certain amount of time. Some recipients may now have to pay some of that money back. The state and local governments are also reporting a huge revenue loss, somewhere between 15 to 45% in most cities and states. Nationally, it's almost a $2 trillion lost over critical programs. And what we're hearing from AASHTO, which represents all the state departments of transportation, that on average states are facing a 30% reduction in their revenue. And we know that when funding for state DOTs is unsure, that affects what they're spending on biking and walking. So with states and local governments having less money, we expect that to also affect what they're building. We've seen it affect what they're building overall, but we also know that very often biking and walking falls further down the line. And then the last point, the National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, they did a survey of their members and found out that 9 out of 10 cities are planning deep cuts to critical services like fire and police. So one that between 1 in every 12 to 1 in every 5 teachers are going to get laid off if there's no more federal aid. So all of this affects how people think about transportation, if they're driving, where they're driving, if they're biking and walking more. Are they going to keep up gym memberships, or are they going to choose to bike more instead? I just want to give you the larger picture as we go into what's happening in the HEROES Act. So the HEROES Act was a $3 trillion Relief and Recovery Act. This is massive, massive. I know we've gotten used to these big numbers, but the stimulus bill that we saw in 2009 was under $1 trillion. And this would be $3 trillion on top of $2 trillion we already spent. And for the Democrats, they knew that this bill probably wasn't going to pass as written, but what they wanted to do was put out their vision for recovery. If they had control, what would they do? And that's why this bill is so big and so far-reaching. They're giving their vision. And they deal with a lot of problems we just talked about. They extend the unemployment increase of that $600. They correct some of the issues with the payroll protection program, including changes to make it work for small businesses, extending the time that people have to pay it off, extending the options they have for how they use that money, etc. And it also includes $500 billion for states and $375 for local governments. And that local government money goes down to smaller cities, it goes to counties and parishes, and it goes to any other government entities that aren't caught up in either cities or counties and parishes. And one of the things we saw in the CARES Act was that funding went to the states and it went to the big cities. And then the state was supposed to use that money in smaller cities or share that money. And the smaller cities said, hey, this isn't working for us. We need our own set of funding. And so that is addressed in the HEROES Act. And I think there's a lot of changes there that Republicans will agree with. So if they do move forward, I think we will see some of those changes moving forward. I also just want to call out in the payroll protection program, there is some new money set aside for nonprofits that goes beyond just the small organizations, but also it includes more types of NGOs or nonprofits, including 501c4s, which were not eligible last time, and other different types of nonprofits, so 501c9s and things like that. So what does it do for transportation? So APTA, the American Public Transit Association, asked for $24 billion over 18 months to do operations, to get PPE for their drivers and other staff, for the cleaning of the vehicles that has to happen every night. They asked for $24 billion, they got $15.75 billion. AASHTO, again, the Association of the State Departments of Transportation, they asked for $50 billion for similar things, operations, keeping their people employed, on projects that are already in process to help pay for the state and local match part because their revenues have lost so much, and also their ability to respond to emergencies, safety emergencies, things like that. They asked for $50 billion for 18 months. They only got $15 billion. So when we compare this to the 2009 stimulus, we saw in 2009 transportation got a little over 3%, got 27 billion out of 838 million, or 27 million out of 838 million. And at the time we thought that was small. We thought more should have gone to transportation. In the HEROES Act, we've got a $3 trillion bill and basically 1% is going to transportation. And that seems crazy because we know the Democrats have talked about infrastructure, right? We know that this is their vision bill. And so there's this question of how did they do all these other things and not include transportation? Well, their reason was that they really think a transportation reauthorization can pass, and they want that to go first before they do any stimulus. So this funding is for operations and administration, keeping everyone employed, keeping the DOT working, making sure that they can respond to safety emergencies. The way it was described to me is that, hey, if you all of a sudden have a sinkhole in one of your roads, we want the DOT to have the cash on hand to fix it. But they did not want tons of new programs coming out of this, new projects. Same with transit agencies, keep people safe, keep them employed, keep them working, get their PPE. And so when we go back to that chart where I was thinking of 3 levels, what I'm hearing from congressional staff is they're seeing 2 different tracks. One is this emergency relief, which is the HEROES Act, which they're hoping to negotiate with the Senate and the White House on. And then maybe they do see a stimulus coming later in the fall. On a totally different track, they see transportation reauthorization happening. So it's not that they don't see transportation in stimulus, they just want the reauthorization to happen first. So the Senate is a little bit different. In the Senate, and this is talking larger than transportation for a second. First, Leader McConnell, he made that statement, states can go bankrupt. I think that was a little bit of a overstatement. He has since sort of changed to say, yes, more aid is likely, we may need it, but let's see how this reopening goes. Let's wait and see if we really need stimulus. And what was happening beneath the surface is that there was a disagreement within the Senate Republican caucus. Many senators really do believe their states need more aid. And part of that is because what happened in the CARES Act is while there was, I think, 150 billion for state and local governments, that money was only to cover direct COVID costs. So, if your state had to go out and buy ventilators or PPE or, hire more staff or overtime, that kind of thing, that's what that was for. But it was not to cover the lost revenue. And what we say in those 10 weeks that CARES covers, or the 3 months that CARES covers, that some states didn't even need all that money for COVID response. Maybe they didn't have a lot of cases then. Maybe they were prepared. But so those states are actually looking at having to giving money back when at the same time they're really hurting because of all the businesses shutting down and the unemployment that they now have to pay, and people losing health care, and all of that. So that is a problem for all states, Republican and Democrat. And so what the Senate has done, and again, this is larger than transportation, they came up with this idea of, okay, maybe we don't want to do economic stimulus. We've put enough money out there, but maybe we do need to do economic stabilization. And what they mean by stabilization is replace that lost revenue and cover COVID costs. So let's make the states whole, but let's not do stimulus. Let's not add new money to create, because stimulus is about creating new jobs, giving, a shot in the arm to the economy. It's above and beyond what was lost. So what would that mean for transportation? Well, if they go with stabilization, that's not new funding. So there's no reason to do new policy. It basically just props up the existing program. So that's a totally different view from where we've been thinking. But remember, anything the Senate does would have to be negotiated with the House. So again, the Senate also sees two different tracks, but they don't even see stimulus. They see emergency relief and stabilization. And I think they do want to see some of those changes to the CARES Act that we've identified with PPP and unemployment and things like that. But they see that as a stabilization, not in a huge $3 trillion bill. And then reauthorization, they see as a different track, and they also think is possible. They think that's regular order. Congress should get back to its regular job. So why are they thinking about reauthorization over stimulus? Their reasons are different. For the House, for the Democratic leadership, they're behind Chairman DeFazio and what he's trying to do, which is we expect the DeFazio transportation bill to really offer some systematic change. We think that will be good for biking and walking in transit. We think there'll be climate issues addressed in there, even more significantly than the Senate bill. They really want to address safety, all the things that we've been talking about, that Democrats have been talking about. Like, they see this as a change for some really transformative policy. And so they want reauthorization to go forward. They don't want to take away from that momentum. At the same time, they don't want to do stimulus before reauthorization, because why would they want to put a bunch of money through the old system when they're going to come up with this new, better system? And they also don't want to create a new program in stimulus because, listen, T&I has been working on this bill for 2 years. They're transportation programmatic experts. They've thought through this, something that the funders, the appropriators, the people who fund the money on, they understand the system, but for them to throw something together really quickly will probably not be as good as something that T&I could do in the long term. But the House also does see a possibility of stimulus after reauthorization. Now, the Senate is taking a little different approach. There's a big concern with Senate leadership over this idea of deficit spending and sort of getting back to that principle of small government. within the Republican Party. And so, you know, a big stimulus means more deficit spending, where reauthorization is sort of, it's regular investment, it's a regular system. They want to require pay-fors for it. It just fits better within their philosophy and what they're doing. They also believe that if there's the House bill, which is not bipartisan, and then you have the Senate bill, which is very bipartisan, the Senate goes into that conference committee and those negotiations between the House and the Senate with the upper hand. And so that's another reason that they could have more of an upper hand on transportation policy than they would on a stimulus. And third, it delivers a win for the president. The president has been talking about infrastructure for a long time. Doing a long-term bill would be a big win. So those are some reasons why they're thinking about reauthorization over stimulus. This is sort of how I think about it in terms of bicycling and walking. With reauthorization, again, we could see some longer-term changes. And then these changes here are all changes that are already in the Senate bill. Changes to how safety funding goes out and ensuring that biking and walking are included in that. We saw in the Senate bill, we saw a 40% increase to transportation alternatives, while the regular spending increase was 20% increase. So we saw a rebalancing there, which is important to us, obviously. And if we got it in the Senate, we think we'll get at least that in the House. It also, the Senate bill includes a climate title for the first time. We know the House wants to go beyond what the Senate did. So if the Senate is our starting point and the House goes beyond it, it seems like there's a lot of good changes for biking and walking that would be in place for years. One thing I may not have mentioned yet is that the Chairman Barrasso is thinking about the possibility of maybe a 2-year versus a 5-year bill. There's good and bad on both of those for biking and walking, but I just want to put that aside as a possibility. Now, stimulus could include a real burst of funding for biking and walking. So we could see a ton of money come in, get a bunch of projects, particularly projects that are already in plans or already in process, specifically those, and get those built. We're not sure whether it would change the percentage, so a stimulus might just grow the pie, so the bike piece grows. It's unlikely to change the other parts of it. It does not include long-term changes, but if we do stimulus now, put off the reauthorization, it could potentially result in a better transportation bill in the future. It's risky, but it's possible. The other thing is post-reauth, if we got a stimulus, that could again add a relative boost to biking and walking if we see some policy changes. So, and I just want to talk about why stimulus is so appealing. This is federal funding for biking and walking from 92 to 2019. And you can see that big jump, that's the 2009 stimulus, our 2 biggest years ever, except for, well, last year caught up, but so you can see why stimulus is so appealing. But I also want to point out that when reauthorization doesn't happen on time and there are extensions and there is uncertainty, we see funding for biking and walking dip, sometimes dip significantly. And so there's a risk as well to putting off reauthorization. So we've talked a lot about reauthorization. Is it even possible to do? Just a quick reminder, to get to reauthorization, we have to go through all these steps. So the first in the Senate, all 4 of these committees have to write their part of the bill. And then the Senate votes on it. Same process in the House. They only have 2 committees, but they have to do their work. House votes on it. Then they get to a conference committee where the House and Senate meet and compromise to come up with one bill, and then the rest of it flows pretty quickly. The only thing that's happened right now is that the Senate EPW committee has written and passed the highways and roads part. So there's this whole process would still need to happen in the next few months while we're social distancing. So is it possible? Is a Senate bill possible? John Barrasso from Wyoming. He did the EPW bill. He is the biggest proponent of this for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of good things in the bill for Wyoming, and two, he's term limited, so this is his last chance to lead on a transportation bill. So he needs the banking committee, which is the Banking, Housing, and Urban Development Committee, to write the transit title. He needs the Commerce Committee to write their title. Both of those committees say they can be ready. They can say they have some language that's written. It hasn't gone through the committee process, but they could rush that, and then they could be attached as an amendment to the EPW bill, and they could move it through. The Finance Committee is a little more difficult because Leader McConnell wants the transportation bill to be paid for. He wants, and that's just really difficult because right now the Highway Trust Fund, which is where we pay gas taxes, it goes into the Highway Trust Fund, and then Congress sends it back out to the states as transportation dollars. People aren't driving. We're not getting that revenue into the Highway Trust Fund. So we'd have to make up even more of that. And then if we want to do even just to do level spending, Congress would have to find, I think it's an additional 27 billion. And then of course, if they want to do more funding than that, they've got to, or maybe it's 27 billion total to make up and to get to where the Senate bill is. Now, to do that, that requires more taxes. Nobody in Congress is going to want to raise taxes in the next 6 months, not when the economy is in crisis. So, that sort of puts them in an awkward position. Also, because we're not collecting the same gas tax revenue, that Highway Trust Fund is going to need a bailout. So Congress is going to have to do something about it because by law, the Highway Trust Fund can't go into deficit spending. So what EPW Chairman Barrasso is discussing, as I just mentioned, is that maybe there is some deficit spending, but maybe we only do a 2-year bill. Because when Congress writes a bill, they send it to the Congressional Budget Office, and then that CBO scores it. And by scores, I mean they determine how much that bill is going to cost us over a certain amount of time. And a 2-year bill costs a lot less than a 5-year bill. And so he's thinking, okay, I know Leader McConnell doesn't want any more deficit spending. Maybe if we just do a 2-year bill, we'll keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent, we'll get some of my new policies, and then we can come back to it after this crisis is over. Now, this is what they did for folks who remember in 2012 when they passed MAP 21 for 2 years. Same process. So they've done it before. The House is a little different. We keep hearing that the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee bill is done or it's almost done. It has been continually 2 weeks away for a long time. But I believe that's because the committee wants to know how they're going to vote on it before they put it out. They have to put it out for a certain amount of time for everyone to read it and write amendments and prepare for voting on it. But they don't want it sitting out there for too long because then there might be, opposition might build to it. And they do expect the bill to be controversial. First, because it is partisan. So anything partisan is controversial. But also because they are talking about systematic changes, longtime major transportation stakeholders are concerned. They don't want to have to change everything they've been doing for so long. So that's, again, AASHTO with the state DOTs, the American Road Builders Association. We think they're going to have some concerns on it, and maybe some others. Now in the House as well, there's the Transportation Committee, then there's the Ways and Means Committee. They're like the Finance Committee in the Senate. They have to find the money. In the House, Ways and Means Committee has been really focused on the HEROES bill, so they haven't really thought through transportation. But if T&I goes, they can move pretty quickly. They're prepared to focus in on infrastructure. And I will say that this is the committee that will decide on the Bicycle Commuter Act. So the first Bicycle Commuter Act also passed as part of a stimulus. We want this to get prepared we are working to get this passed as part of the reauthorization and or stimulus. So when I talked about the House waiting for process, that's because they have to do a markup, and they have to do a markup. The committee has to vote on it. They're planning to do this in June. When I say markup, that's where the members, um, they can offer amendments, they can debate those amendments, and then they vote on amendments, and then they vote on the entire bill. For a bill like this, in person, in committee, you would expect it to take many hours, maybe 5, 6 hours. It can even go later, 7, 8 hours, usually a day. They're thinking about doing this remotely, which is what's sort of holding this up, is figuring out how to do it remotely. So this is a picture of a hearing, I think last year. You can see all the people sitting against the wall in the back or standing against the wall on the side. Those are all committee staff. There's at least one per member who's sitting in the room, so some of them may be on the other wall. And when something comes up, they may have to, they're the experts, they're the content experts, right? So they may be running over to the member, whispering in their ear, handing them a piece of paper. Maybe something else happens in the office, they need to get it in front of them. So there's a lot of close contact. When we talk about doing it remotely, the staff will be in their homes, the member will be in their homes. And so it's just, Congress in general is an older group of people, maybe less tech savvy, used to having staff, not used to having to do a lot of things on their own. This is a very complicated process. So they're trying to figure that out first. They're saying this could take 2 to 3 days remotely. So once they figure that out, they can move forward. So here's the steps, the timeline, and what those challenges are. Again, for TNI, it's not bipartisan, and it's trying to figure out how to do this remotely. If TNI goes in June, it's very possible this could happen. If TNI does not go in June, it could really slow things down. Again, if TNI goes, Ways and Means will need a little time to prepare, but they'll go pretty quickly. The Senate, it's not, they would need leadership support to really push this forward, so McConnell would have to get on board. And they would have to get their members on board to passing these other bills without a lot of input. And this is where a 2-year bill comes in as well. When you're doing a 5 or 6 year bill, it's hard to go around the normal process because everyone wants to weigh into something. This could be their only shot. It's their only shot this term. But if you're talking a 2-year bill, people may be willing to go through a less inclusive process. So then the Senate would have to go, pass on the floor, and then we get to the conference committee. And again, this is the part where the House and the Senate have to negotiate, come up with one bill. Doing it in 2 months would be rushed. Usually in August, members are quote unquote on recess, which means they're home in their districts. They've been home in their districts. It is an election year. Maybe staff works for a year and then they try to for a month and then they bring the members in. It'd be very difficult for them to do this in 6 weeks to a month, but it's possible. Some of the things that, and again, sort of a lot of the touchy issues really get worked out face to face. The conference committee is this really interesting piece of how a bill becomes a law because it's the one piece that is not public. This is done behind closed doors so that members will compromise. And we don't know exactly who compromised what. If all of that was public, members wouldn't compromise, we'd never get bills. So that'll be interesting. We'll have to see what role the White House plays. They said they're going to come up with a draft. Are they going to insert themselves? That could slow everything down. I don't know. Hopefully they can do this. The Senate bill will be favored because it is bipartisan. So we'll have to see how that comes out. If they get out of conference committee, the rest is easy. If it doesn't pass, it will depend on where they are in the process. So if they've actually passed the House and the Senate, they're in conference committee or they're ready to go to conference committee, they may just do a short-term extension, just get them to December, see if they can work through the process. And they'll just extend, maybe add a little funding to Highway Trust Fund. If it doesn't work out, another possibility is that they extend it for a year. Now, it's hard, and then put stimulus money in to fund the Highway Trust Fund for a year. This is something, the strategy on this is really difficult because both the House and Senate bills expire when we go into a new Congress. And so in the House, if the Democrats retain control, DeFazio stays chair, not a big deal. They can just reintroduce their whole bill and move on. In the Senate, it's a little different because Chairman Barrasso will no longer be chairman. And so if the Republicans maintain it, the new chair, Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia, she might want to put her priorities in there. If the control of the Senate changes, then we have Chairman Carper. He may want to rewrite the bill. And so then it could be longer than just a year. Then we could be talking long term. The other problem is if we get past this year, will Congress be willing to deficit spend for a transportation bill? If we get through COVID, there's a sense that Congress is not going to be wanting to do any more deficit spending for a while. And so that could slow it down for a long time. And that's the fear, that this will lead to a multi-year extension. And then, of course, if they can't do a bill, do they then do stimulus? And what could change that calculus to make, okay, let's do a stimulus bill before reauthorization? One, if the reauthorization process blows up. They can't make it work. We're going into a new Congress. Oh, yeah, maybe the chair changes, all of that. Then the House may say, well, maybe we do want to do some transportation stimulus. Even if it is the old program, we still need some funding for infrastructure and transportation. And between now and the elections, or now and the end of the year, the calculus could change for the Senate. They may want to be seen as supporting aid to states and to cities and to be creating jobs. If the economy gets worse, they may change their position on that. They may also want to give President Trump a win. And if this isn't resolved by November, the election could change if the Dems sweep. Maybe they say, hey, it isn't so bad to wait for a bill because it's going to be an even better bill in their mind. But at the same point, they have to deal with that issue of, do they have enough votes to deficit spend after COVID? It's not clear that they will, or that they could get a bill passed. They also might agree to a 2-year Senate bill. And then, because knowing that then it's going to take more than a year to write a new bill, why not start with where the Senate bill is? It puts us in a better position moving forward. They can go from there. So how do we position bicycling to benefit from any of these scenarios? I think first, we need to build on a message that works. What we have found through this reauthorization process is that safety works. It works for Republicans, it works for Democrats, it works for people in rural areas, it works for people in urban areas and in suburban areas. And that we can say is, first, we need safe infrastructure. We need better bike and walking network. We need complete streets. It's something that the US DOT leadership lists as a top priority, and they have some real interest in. It's something Senator Carper, who is the ranking Democrat in the Senate on transportation, it was one of his top 3 priorities. Senator Capito from West Virginia, who would be chair next time, it's a real focus of hers, particularly pedestrian safety. So all of that's really good. DeFazio, multiple T&I members really care about bicycling and pedestrian safety. And so we want to move forward with that. We also want to avoid transportation alternatives becoming a partisan issue. In 2012, the predecessor of transportation alternatives was a program called Transportation Enhancements. That became a partisan issue. And as a result, we lost 30% of the funding in the first year. The Republican bill in the House at that point defunded all biking and walking funding programs. It also defunded transit. And so when they went into conference, the Senate bill won out, so we still got transportation alternatives, but we got a huge cut in funding. And that was a case where the Senate bill was bipartisan, House was not. We also really need to build support among House Republicans. And so that's why safety versus quote unquote dedicated funding works better. We've been talking to members on the committee. We're trying to get them to a point where even if they won't say something publicly in a hearing or a markup where it's very partisan, that when we get to conference committee, they're willing to express their support for biking and walking. And part of that, a lot of that will wait until after the House bill is released. And if you are in one of those districts, we may be contacting you to ask for your help with that. And also, instead of talking about funding in terms of a dollar amount or dedicated funding, we really want to talk about not the dollar amount, but what that will build. We want to talk about safe networks. We want to talk about, hey, there's this dangerous intersection in your community. This is how we could fix it. Economic development, what that trail could mean. We also want to meet the moment regarding COVID. And we don't necessarily want to talk about this as an opportunity, because we want to be sensitive to the situation, but I think we can talk about the fact that the trends in society are changing, and it's important that whatever we invest in now addresses those changes and gets it right now and for the future. Safety now, safety tomorrow. Safety today, safety tomorrow. So some of those trends that we're seeing what could be a long-term reduction in commuting, right? We're definitely saw the short term. We don't expect it to pick up anytime soon, and it may not pick up for years, or it may just stay lower. We've seen the increase in biking and walking, and biking and walking as transportation may become more and more necessary with economic hardship as well. We've also seen that even though there's less people driving, speeding has increased and crashes have increased. I think crashes have increased 14% per vehicle mile traveled over the last month. We also need to think about essential workers and essential trips. We need options while transit is not recommended. Can we make connections to transit and making connections to transit when transit is necessary? So we are seeing some transit stops disappearing with less people using it, with transit not having any revenue. So can we make sure that people who now have to travel further to get to transit have a safe way to do that? And of course, social distancing and health. We know that physical activity and recreation are key to those, and that people need to be able to bike and walk and be able to do so at a safe distance and following the public health guidelines. So what the League is doing, we're starting a new campaign. We have both a sign-on letter and a petition using this messaging, talking about what we want. So safe streets for today and tomorrow. We are pulling in what we know the decision makers, whether it's DOT, the House or the Senate, care about. This is a quote from Nicole Nason during her confirmation hearing to be the Federal Highway Administration Administrator, the head of FHWA. And she talked specifically about improving pedestrian cyclist safety by focusing on improved road design and targeting our most dangerous intersections. So, and we want to use that to talk about, to say, hey, Congress, as you are addressing the changes needed both during COVID and post-COVID, please address the long-time threat to safety. So this is a problem that existed before COVID, but you can actually work to fix it as you're responding to COVID versus exacerbate it. And so these are the things that we want to do to improve safety, invest in safe and accessible networks, institute a federal complete streets policy, incentivize fixes to existing roads and intersections, institute the Bicycle Commuter Act of 2019, and make accessibility data available to states and local governments to improve connectivity planning. So both, and all of that in the short and long term. We also at the short term are asking for some temporary regulatory relief to do temporary structures. So how to get involved? You'll get this in your email as well, but there is an organizational sign-on letter and a petition for individuals. And then finally, I just want to talk about long-term success. Some of the things we've identified that we really need is, one, to understand the changes we're seeing, and we're hearing about anecdotally. Like, everyone's seeing more people biking. We've seen it on the EcoConner trackers and on the trails, but we need to know a little bit more, like, who is it that's now biking and walking more? Is it all recreation, or is part of this transportation as well? And where are they doing it? Where do they need to go? And then it would be great to know how all these people who are biking are thinking about it. Are they thinking about this is something they're loving it, they want to do it long term? What would stop them from that? How can we help them continue to enjoy that? So we need to know how to engage these new and returning bicyclists into the movement, both for now and in the future. And we also need to push the advocacy at all levels. I think when we talk to bicycle-friendly communities, they see the number one impediment to them is that they need more political will to do more for biking and walking. And we know the best way to create political will is through advocacy. But also at the state level, we always talk about the state DOTs being key decision makers. At the federal level, we can work to push money down, both the local governments, which we know support, but also try to connect it and incentivize it to do safer streets, to do biking and walking infrastructure, all of that. But a lot of that, there's only so much we can do at the federal level. We then need the states to implement it. And so that idea of really pushing state level advocacy on this is key to us. So at the League, we are thinking through what resources we can give to state level organizations who are interested in thinking about this. And so if you have ideas of what would be helpful for you to push advocacy as new funding comes through a reauthorization or a stimulus, if you have any of this data in your local area or your state, or you know where it is, we'd love to work with you on that. If there's something we can do to help you, please let us know, because we are asking you to help us with this petition, with signing this letter. So thanks for listening. I'll do another one of these in late June, so please look for that. This was just a recording, so please do. I'll send around the questions that I got when I did this live, but please think of joining live if you have questions, or just email me questions you have now. So thank you.